weapons, and the heroes who shaped the greatest conflicts of all time. Battlefront, the story of military history. During his reign, Adolf Hitler turned the failing nation of Germany into a modern industrial power based entirely on military production. The result was the Wehrmacht, the mobile power of the Third Reich. One of the crowning achievements of the Third Reich was the Luftwaffe, the Air Force. The Luftwaffe had been built totally from scratch because of the terms of the Versailles Treaty that forbade Germany from building aircraft. During the 1920s, however, secret organizations linked with the civil airline Lufthansa began training pilots for military operations. When he became Chancellor, Hitler began his Air Force, placing Hermann Göring in charge. Although Göring became the head of the Luftwaffe, it was organized by a man named Erhard Milch. Milch had worked with the Lufthansa, and despite his Jewish ancestry, he became the silent organizer of the Luftwaffe. Until 1935, the power of the Luftwaffe was kept secret. During Spain's revolution, about 100 aircraft known as the Condor Legion aided the fascists. Although the aircraft performed superbly, it was only a small display of the strength they would later achieve. Much of the strength of the Luftwaffe came from its fighters. Through most of the war, the principal fighters of the Luftwaffe were the Messerschmitt Bf-109s. The 109's strength was unchallenged until the British Supermarine Spitfire and the American P-47 and P-59 entered the war. The 109 was created by Willy Messerschmitt in the summer of 1934. He was director of design in a German aircraft manufacturing firm in Augsburg. He was personally requested by Göring to develop and build a more efficient fighter for the Luftwaffe. The smallest possible airframe was used to accommodate the 695 horsepower Rolls-Royce Kestrel, the most powerful engine of the time. The first prototype successfully completed initial flight trials in September 1935. The 109 went on to win the International Flying Contest at Zurich in 1937. The first combat model was the Bf-109D. It had several shortcomings, but was still the best warplane of the time. It outclassed the B and C models, which were used in the Spanish Civil War, and had fought well in Poland. It possessed a speed of 357 miles per hour at 11,500 feet and a range of 350 miles. The D was quickly replaced by the 109E, which acquitted itself well in the Battle of Britain. It was the Luftwaffe's chief plane through 1940. The E had a range 60 miles greater than that of the D and could operate at much higher elevations. It also had a much heavier armament, which resulted in a loss of speed. The E's chief purpose in the Battle of Britain was escort to the medium bombers attacking England. Due to Göring's failed strategy, the 109E was forced to stay with the slow-moving bombers, which made it easy prey for the RAF's pilots. The E had several roles, including ground attack and reconnaissance. The introduction of the F model in 1941 brought many changes. The F now had a new tapered nose, improved aerodynamics, greater ceiling, and with the use of a drop tank, had a range exceeding 500 miles. The F proved to be the best model, with a fully developed Daimler-Benz engine, which supplied 1,200 horsepower at takeoff and better maneuverability. The drawback of the F model was its light armament. The 109F served with great distinction on the Eastern Front. The final model, introduced in 1942, was the G model, which attempted to correct the problem of light armament that the F had. The increased armament made the plane much heavier, which resulted in difficulties in acceleration and climb. Its climb speed actually decreased by almost a minute, which could mean certain death when fighting the British Spitfire or American P-59. The G did have increased range and elevation, and the extra armament made it a formidable machine when fighting slower 2- to 4-engine aircraft. The G and F models were famous for their roles as anti-bomber defense fighters and fought many battles with great Allied bombers like the B-17 and B-24. The only other achievement for Messerschmitt was the twin-engine Bf-110. It was initially designed as a bomber-destroyer, but it was placed in service as a fighter when it entered the war in 1940. It was not a good fighter, proving terribly vulnerable to British single-seat fighters like the Spitfire and Hurricane. The 110 accomplished little until it was returned to its original role in 1941 and 1942. The 110 had a range of 565 miles, which far exceeded those of the 109s. It lacked speed, however, and although having a ceiling of 32,000 feet, was slow to climb, over 10 minutes just to reach 19,000 feet. By far the greatest German fighter of World War II was the Focke-Wulf FW-190. The 190 superseded all the Messerschmitts with its superior speed of 426 miles per hour, ceiling of 37,000 feet, and range of 520 miles. Although introduced as early as 1941, it did not enter mass production until 1943, and therefore could not fight to its full potential. The 190 received the nickname Bottleneck for its unusual shape. Although German bombers played a key role in the powerful Blitzkrieg attack, they never achieved the size and strength of those used by Britain and the United States. Dive bombing was an essential attack used to soften enemy armor and destroy important lines of communication. For this important job, the Third Reich used the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. The abbreviation Stuka applied to all dive bombing aircraft, but came to be most associated with the Ju-87. The Stuka's payload consisted of 4 110-pound bombs and one 1,100-pound bomb. Although it fought with incredible success in the beginning of the war, catastrophic losses to the British reveal it as a second-rate aircraft. It was used long after it became obsolete, with production totaling over 5,700 between 1938 and 1944. During the war, Germany relied greatly on its two medium bombers, the Heinkel HE-111 and the Dorner Do-17. Both were twin-engined and had a crew of 4. The Dorner 17 had a range of only 721 miles and a maximum bomb load of 2,200 pounds. The Heinkel HE-111 was much better armed and had a range of 1,280 miles with a maximum bomb load of 4,400 pounds. Although both bombers gained easy superiority over continental Europe, they were easy prey for the Royal Air Force. Both bombers were developed in the 1930s, and Germany failed to produce a true 4-engine bomber. Besides bombing and aerial supremacy, the Luftwaffe had another unique job: transportation. Transportation of men and supplies by air was often faster and more efficient than by ground. For aerial transportation, the Luftwaffe relied heavily on the Junkers Ju-52. This massive 3-engine behemoth was an essential item to the Wehrmacht in Russia and North Africa. The Ju-52 could carry up to 18 troops and had a range of 920 miles. Its ridiculously slow speed of 198 miles per hour and poor armament made fighter escort essential. The Ju-52 was most useful in the Eastern Front and Africa, where it carried fuel and ammunition to fighting units. It was also used by paratroopers for daring aerial assaults. Although the Ju-52 formed the strength of the Luftwaffe transport fleet, gliders such as the DFS-230 were also widely used. The DFS-230 could carry 8 troops, or a maximum weight of 2,720 pounds, and travel at a speed of 181 miles per hour. Reconnaissance was another job taken up by the industrious Luftwaffe. One of the first reconnaissance planes was the Focke-Wulf Condor FW-200. The Condor began as a commercial plane in 1937, but at the outbreak of World War II was turned into a maritime reconnaissance bomber. With its speed of 224 miles per hour and range of 2,175 miles, it became known as the Scourge of the Atlantic because it directed U-boats to various Allied convoys in the Atlantic. The Luftwaffe developed other reconnaissance aircraft, such as the Junkers Ju-88D, which specialized in long-range reconnaissance and sometimes functioned as a light bomber. Propaganda and recruiting posters were an important part of gaining support for the Luftwaffe. This poster, which circulated from 1938 to 1940, is a typical example. A perfect Aryan profile rests over a rich blue and gold background. The Luftwaffe was often treated romantically and was almost always associated with gold, blue, and the Condor. The Luftwaffe formed a large part of the German armed forces, and it filled an essential role in the devastating Blitzkrieg attack. The Luftwaffe had supremacy in the sky until 1942, when Britain and America produced aircraft that could challenge even the most determined Nazi ace.
Robert I, also known as Robert the Bruce, was one of the most influential and interesting leaders in the dreadful Middle Ages. He was born in 1274, and despite early misgivings, became Scotland's most gallant and patriotic kings. Much of Bruce's military career was spent in fighting against the English. Though he initially swore allegiance to Edward I, King of England, he switched fidelity frequently. He lost the Scottish throne to John de Balliol in a lawsuit, and was excommunicated by the Catholic Church when Bruce was found to be involved in the death of John Comyn the Red. Bruce fought the English until he was ousted from England and took refuge in Ireland. Edward II, who succeeded the successful Leopard of England, was a thoughtful homosexual who had no stomach for fighting. Unfortunately, the times forced Edward II to mount a campaign against the rebellious Scots. Through a series of brilliant military campaigns, Robert the Bruce reclaimed his Scottish homeland from the English. Final victory would not come, however, until June 24, 1314, in the Battle of Bannockburn. Just south of the formidable Castle of Stirling, with gallant fighting, Robert Bruce's meager force was able to defeat the larger English contingent. During the battle, one of Edward II's commanders, Sir Humphrey de Bohun, hoped to achieve immortality by challenging the Scots king to a single combat. Robert was a skilled soldier and neatly cut Sir Humphrey's head in half with his axe. The defeat at Bannockburn put an end to England's attempt to gain control of Scotland, and Edward II returned to his male companions. Under Edward III, Scotland's independence and the right of Bruce to the throne were finally recognized. Bruce became King Robert I in 1328, but died about a year later. Robert the Bruce was a courageous and valiant leader. His exploits won him national acclaim, and the famous Scottish poet Robert Burns wrote Bruce to his men at Bannockburn, a poem glorifying Bruce's victory in the 1314 battle. An interesting story about Robert goes as follows. While hiding from his enemies, Bruce was lying in a bed in a hut. On the roof above him, he saw a spider swinging from one of its threads. It was trying to swing itself from one beam to another, but it had tried 6 times and failed. Bruce realized that he had fought the same number of battles in vain against the English. He decided that if the spider tried and succeeded a 7th time, he would also try to fight the English again. The spider's 7th attempt was successful. Bruce took heart and went forth to victory.
Just beyond the icy clutches of the Arctic Circle, 2 nations would fight a battle like the biblical struggle between David and Goliath. It was the Russo-Finnish War, also known as the Winter War. It was caused by Finland's refusal to cede important territory to Russia. After pointless diplomatic meetings, Russia attacked Finland on November 30th, when rumors arose that Finnish troops had attacked the Russians on the 26th. The chief architect of Finland's defense was Marshal Carl Gustaf Mannerheim. Mannerheim was born in 1867 and joined the Russian army in 1889. He led Finland in its War of Independence in 1918 and came out of retirement in 1931 to once again lead Finland's military. He died in Switzerland in 1951. Despite Mannerheim's efforts, Finland faced the Russian onslaught with only 120,000 troops and 100 aircraft, most of which were not battle-worthy. The Russians had 300,000 men with 800 aircraft.
Now hear this. All hands clear the flight deck. All hands clear the flight deck. Prepare aircraft for the 1100 launch.
Home.
Tower, this is Victor 203.
We're free to enjoy its simple pleasures.
Roger 203.
Because they're out here, guaranteed that freedom. The men and women of the Navy, out here today, safeguarding your tomorrow.
Good job, 203. Welcome home.
In the air, the Finns relied on the British-built Gloucester Gladiator I. The plane itself was flown by Swedish pilots and did not enter the conflict until the early months of 1940. The Gladiator was armed with 4.303-inch Browning machine guns in the wings and fuselage. It could achieve a speed of 203 miles per hour and had a range of 428 miles. With small numbers and mechanical failures, the Gladiator did not earn the Finns' aerial superiority, but helped relieve pressure on the ground troops from strafing attacks. On the other side, the Russians had the superior fighter in the Yakovlev Yak-1. The Yak-1 was armed with one 20mm Schwach cannon and two 7.62mm Schkass machine guns. Later models were able to carry 6 RS-82 rockets. The Yak-1 had a speed of 364 miles per hour and a range of 435 miles. While the Finns had no large armored force, the Russians defied the cold and treacherous terrain by sending in several tank brigades comprising mostly of the BT-72. This tank certainly never achieved the speed and power of the later Joseph Stalin line, but it was the Russians' chief armored weapon throughout the conflict. Its armor ranged anywhere from 6 to 22 millimeters in thickness, and it was armed with a 45mm gun and two 7.62mm machine guns. It had a crew of 3, could achieve a speed of 33 miles per hour, and had a range of 220 miles. The Finnish soldiers, well used to the difficult terrain of forests and lakes, experts on skis, and filled with an indomitable will, practiced an effective guerrilla fighting tactic throughout the skirmish. The Finns' weapons were not modern or exceptionally successful. The chief weapon was the Suomi 9mm submachine gun, which functioned well in the below-zero conditions, but it was not ideal for forest usage. The Finnish army also used improvised incendiary projectiles called Molotov cocktails. The Finns had an incredible sense of patriotism, and they were deeply resolved to defend their country. The Finnish army was favored with the difficult terrain. Much of Finland was covered by forests trenched with snow and many frozen lakes. These difficult features made travel by land almost impossible, and armed units were useless except on roads where they were easy targets for Finnish hit-and-run attacks. Russia's first offensive against Finland was a fiasco. The Russian army was stopped in its tracks by the pillboxes and anti-tank obstacles that cluttered the extensive Mannerheim line. The offensive carried on through the winter of 1939. At the end of the conflict, the Finns lost 2,700 men, but captured 80 tanks and 70 guns, as well as 1,600 prisoners of war. No exact count has been given for the number of Russian soldiers who died in the first offensive of the Winter War, but estimates exceed 27,000. The humiliating defeat of the Russian forces in the first offensive was attributed to many causes. According to Mannerheim in his memoirs,
in December, the enemy attacks resembled a badly directed orchestra, with every instrument ignoring the beat. Their artillery deluged us with shells, but its practice was very bad and not at all related to the movement of its own infantry and tank forces. The latter had curious tactics of their own. They would advance, open fire, and fall back before the supporting infantry had had time to make any move. These mistakes cost the Red Army very dear.
Mannerheim showed great insight into the mind of the Russian soldier.
The Russian infantryman was brave, tough, and content with little, but he lacked initiative. He was a gregarious fighter, incapable of independent action. In the first battles, the Russians would often advance singing across minefields in serried ranks, sometimes even with linked arms, without seeming to be worried by the explosions or the punishing fire of the defenders. Moreover, while many of their divisions were made up of men who originally came from wooded areas, they were incapable of moving and fighting successfully in forests. A dearth of compasses added to their difficulties, and the forest, the best ally of the Finnish guerrillas, struck terror into the Russians. It was in the forest that the White Death prowled, the Finnish partisan in his winter equipment. But the biggest weakness of the Russian soldier was their inadequate training for ski operations. They tried to make up for this during the first weeks, but proficiency on skis cannot be learned in a few weeks, and certainly not on the battlefield.
The Russians seemed to agree with Mannerheim, and in their history of the Great Patriotic War, the only recorded Russian acknowledgement of the Winter War, they cited the Russian soldier as the cause of the failure of the first offensive.
In attack, the Soviet troops showed certain failures in preparation and command. Some formations had been insufficiently trained in fighting on skis, in sub-zero conditions, and in regions of dense forests and lakes. There was a lack of experience in attacking permanent installations and concrete emplacements.
Much of the Russians' failures came from the commanders, who did not account for the patriotism and maneuverability of the Finnish people and soldiers, in sending armored and motorized columns into dense forests where they were easily stopped by the Finnish partisans. A great deal of blame can be placed on Stalin himself. His purge of the Red Army's officers in 1937 and 38 destroyed many of Russia's greatest leaders. 3 out of 5 marshals had been killed, 13 out of 15 army generals, 57 out of 85 corps commanders, 110 out of 195 divisional commanders, and 220 out of 406 brigade commanders. This meant that 403 out of 706 experienced and intelligent generals had been wiped out. While the remaining officers may have been loyal, they were certainly not capable of leading a massive war against a patriotic and skilled people. Hitler's attitude of malevolent neutrality toward the Finns certainly didn't help either side. Hitler would not assist Russia, and he forbade Italy to send arms to Finland. Never willing to admit defeat, facing condemnation from the League of Nations, and having learned from the mistakes of the first offensive, Stalin made his second attack in the early months of 1940. About 40% of Russia's land forces in the European area were thrust into the assault. Command was placed under Marshal Semyon Timoshenko. Timoshenko was given a large army with 24 infantry divisions, 20 artillery regiments consisting of about 720 guns, 7 armored brigades with 455 tanks, and 15 new regiments of the Red Air Force with 450 aircraft. Despite initial setbacks, Timoshenko launched his massive offensive on February 1st, 1940, although there had been border skirmishes since December. The new Russian attack was relentless. Mannerheim discussed the second push in his memoirs, saying,
The Russians had now learned to coordinate their different arms. Their artillery fire was flexible, adapted to the movements of the infantry, and it was directed with great precision from observation balloons and by observers mounted on tanks. As the enemy spared neither his men nor his tanks, his losses were still terrible. Enemy losses were so heavy that in one day we took prisoners from as many as 20 freshly committed units.
The Finnish troops fought hard, but could not hope to hold out against the massive Soviet onslaught. On March 12th, running low on ammunition and manpower, the Finns surrendered and signed the Russo-Finnish Treaty, which gave the Russians the important territories they desired. The Finnish army never ran short of morale, and its patriotism and determination was remarkable. Of the 600,000 men called to its defense, Finland lost 24,934 and 43,557 wounded. The Red Army did not fare as well. Although official counts of casualties stated 48,745 were killed and 158,863 wounded, the actual numbers were far greater. This was due to poor organization of the Army, inadequate medical facilities, and the Soviet government's attempt to make the size of the blunder seem less. The Red Army also lost 1,600 tanks and 872 aircraft. Russia's attack was generally condemned by the rest of the world. Most nations sent supplies to Finland, but Sweden alone sent more than 8,000 volunteers, plus 85 anti-tank guns, 112 field guns, 104 anti-aircraft guns, 500 machine guns, and 80,000 rifles. Finland fell to the Soviet war machine, but the Finns put up an excellent and honorable fight defending their homeland.